She was just another first-class passenger, quiet, polite, and patiently waiting for her drink. But when the flight attendant reached her row, everything changed. The juice that had been poured for every other passenger was suddenly unavailable. The warm, friendly service that had accompanied each glass before her turned cold, and when she asked why, all she received were flimsy excuses. What the flight attendant didn't know was that she had just refused service to the daughter of the airline's owner, and the message the young girl had just sent was about to change everything. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. The cabin buzzed with soft murmurs as passengers settled into their seats, adjusted their bags, and flipped through in-flight magazines. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and airline meals drifted through the air as flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisles. Among them was Ms. Alden, a senior flight attendant known for her strict demeanor. She carried herself with an air of authority, ensuring that everything ran exactly as she liked. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid, and her sharp eyes scanned the first-class cabin, missing nothing. Near the window, a teenage girl, Lena Calloway, sat quietly. Her seatbelt was fastened, and her hands rested on her lap. She had traveled alone before, many times in fact, but today felt different. Excitement buzzed in her chest. Soon she would reach her destination, where her father, Emerson Calloway, was waiting. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, Lena wasn't the type to attract attention. She wasn't looking for trouble, and she certainly wasn't expecting any. A few minutes after takeoff, the flight attendants began their service. Miss Alden moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, greeting passengers with polite smiles and offering drinks from the silver tray in her hands. She poured fresh orange juice into a tall glass for the businessman in seat 1A, handed sparkling water to the woman in 1B, and filled a crystal-clear goblet with apple juice for the man across the aisle. But when she reached Lena's seat, something changed. Her smile faded slightly, her eyes flicking over the girl with a brief pause, so quick that most wouldn't have noticed. But Lena did. "Could I have some orange juice, please?" Lena asked politely. Ms. Alden barely spared her a glance as she straightened the tray in her hands. "We're only serving water right now," she replied curtly before turning to the next passenger. Lena blinked, confused. She had just watched the same woman pour 3 different types of juice for the passengers in front of her. She looked down at her tray table, where a glass of water had been placed, without her even asking. Something felt off, but she brushed it aside. Maybe the juice service would come later. Minutes passed. Miss Alden continued moving down the aisle, her tone light and friendly as she chatted with other passengers. Lena watched as another flight attendant, a younger woman named Celia Reyes, came down the aisle holding a fresh tray. This one was filled with even more juice options: pineapple, cranberry, and a special fruit blend for those who requested it. One by one, passengers around her received their drinks, the glasses clinking softly as they were placed on tray tables. Lena waited. When Miss Alden passed by again, she tried once more, offering a small smile. "Excuse me, could I have some juice now?" Miss Alden stopped, turning back with an impatient look. "Like I said, we're only serving water for now." Lena's stomach twisted. She wasn't the type to argue, but she wasn't imagining things. The man sitting 2 seats away had just received a glass of pineapple juice. The woman across the aisle was stirring ice cubes in a tall glass of apple juice. Swallowing, Lena kept her voice steady. "I just saw you give juice to them." Miss Alden's eyes narrowed slightly. Her fingers tightened around the tray, but her expression remained unreadable. "Look, young lady, I don't have time to go back and forth. We have limited supplies, and juice is reserved for first-class passengers." The words were sharp, but it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The condescending tone, the dismissive glance, the way she looked at Lena like she was a problem that needed to be handled quickly. The man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward them before quickly looking away, pretending not to notice. The woman near the front suddenly became very interested in the safety pamphlet she had ignored earlier. Celia Reyes, who had been serving drinks nearby, hesitated mid-step. Her brows drew together, but she said nothing. Lena felt her face grow warm. not just from confusion, but from something deeper. This wasn't about the juice anymore. It was about the fact that she was the only one being refused. The fact that this woman had looked at her and, without asking a single question, had decided she didn't belong here. Taking a slow breath, Lena picked up her phone and quickly typed a message. "Dad, the flight attendant is refusing to serve me juice. Everyone else got one, but she told me it's only for first-class passengers." She pressed send, then locked her screen, gripping the edge of her tray table tightly. Ms. Alden turned and walked back toward the galley without a second glance. She had no idea that the message Lena had just sent would change everything. Lena placed her phone on her lap, her fingers still gripping the tray table. The cabin felt colder now, the quiet hum of the plane unable to drown out the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. She stole a glance at the passengers around her, wondering if anyone had truly noticed what had happened. The businessman across the aisle adjusted his tie, pretending to focus on his laptop screen. The woman near the front sipped her drink slowly, eyes glued to her in-flight magazine. They had seen it, but silence was easier. A soft vibration in her lap caught her attention. Her father, Emerson Calloway, had replied. "What do you mean she refused? Did she say why?" Lena hesitated before typing back. "She acted like I don't belong in first class. She said the juice is for first-class passengers only, but she gave it to everyone else." There was a long pause. Then, 3 dots appeared, showing that he was typing. Then the message came through. "What's the flight number?" Lena's heart pounded as she quickly checked her boarding pass and sent him the details. Her father was never the type to react impulsively, but she knew him well enough to recognize when he was angry. His silence between messages wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. A few rows ahead, Celia made her way toward the galley, her steps slower than usual. She had seen everything, and though she wasn't sure what she could do, the situation left a bitter taste in her mouth. Miss Alden had been with the airline for years, but this wasn't the first time Celia had witnessed her treating certain passengers differently. It was just the first time it had been this blatant. Inside the galley, Miss Alden casually poured herself a small cup of coffee, her expression unreadable. Celia hesitated before speaking. "Did that girl in 3A really not get any juice?" Ms. Alden barely glanced up. She asked after I had already served. I didn't have time to double back. Celia frowned, but there was still juice left. Ms. Alden let out a small, dismissive chuckle. "Look, Celia, you'll learn that some passengers like to test boundaries. She probably got that seat as a hand-me-down or through some mix-up. First-class service is for first-class passengers. It's not a buffet." Celia stiffened. "She is a first-class passenger." Miss Alden rolled her eyes. "I don't need a lecture. Go check on row 5. Celia hesitated, but eventually walked away, though the unease sat heavy in her chest. Something about this didn't feel right. Back in her seat, Lena refreshed her phone screen, waiting for her father's response. When it finally came through, it was just 2 words. "Stay seated." Lena exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what her father was planning, but one thing was certain. Ms. Alden had just made a serious mistake. Lena stared at her phone. Those 2 words were playing in her mind. Stay seated. They carried more weight than anything else he could have said. She knew her father well. He wasn't the type to let things slide. If he told her to stay put, that meant something was already in motion. She shifted in her seat, looking toward the front of the cabin where Ms. Alden was now chatting with another passenger. Her posture relaxed, as if she hadn't just humiliated someone. The sight of Miss Alden acting so normal, as if nothing had happened, made Lena's stomach twist. Minutes passed. The flight attendants continued their service, offering refills to other passengers, while Lena's tray remained untouched. Celia Reyes walked by, her eyes lingering on Lena's still full glass of water before she hesitantly looked away. She wanted to say something, she really did, but the tension in the cabin made it difficult. Then an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Miss Alden, please report to the cockpit immediately." A few passengers glanced up at the sudden call. Lena's grip on her phone tightened. Up near the galley, Ms. Alden frowned. Flight attendants didn't get called to the cockpit unless something was serious. She quickly smoothed her uniform, adjusting her collar before making her way toward the front of the plane. Celia watched her go, her brows slightly furrowed. Inside the cockpit, Captain Elliot Grayson sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him. His face was calm, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that made Ms. Alden straighten her posture. On the screen of the in-flight phone, a man appeared. Someone Miss Alden instantly recognized as Russell Kane, the airline's senior operations manager. For the first time, her confidence flickered. She had only spoken to Russell once before, and it wasn't under casual circumstances. His voice was crisp and direct. "Miss Alden, we have received a complaint regarding your in-flight service. A first-class passenger was denied a standard beverage request. Can you explain why?" Miss Alden stiffened, but quickly forced a polite smile. "I assure you, sir, there was no refusal. We have a limited supply of beverages, and I simply hadn't gotten to her request yet." Russell's expression didn't change. "That's not the report we received." The air inside the cockpit felt heavier. Miss Alden instinctively clasped her hands in front of her, a habit whenever she was under pressure. "With all due respect, passengers misunderstand things all the time. I was simply following standard procedure." For the first time, the captain, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Are you aware of who this passenger is?" Miss Alden frowned, glancing between them. I don't believe so." Russell leaned slightly closer to the screen. "Her name is Lena Calloway. Her father owns this airline." The words hit Miss Alden like a sudden drop in altitude. Her breath caught just for a second, but she quickly recovered, forcing a composed expression. No excuses." Russell's voice was sharp now. "You will return to your station immediately, provide the service that was requested, and issue an apology in front of the passengers." Ms. Alden swallowed. This wasn't just an order, it was a warning. She nodded stiffly. "Understood." As she turned to leave the cockpit, her pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent years controlling passengers, ensuring they followed the rules of her cabin. But now, for the first time, she was the one being ordered to fix her mistake. And she had no idea what was waiting for her when she stepped back into the aisle. Ms. Alden stepped out of the cockpit, her breath uneven. She forced herself to walk calmly back toward the first-class cabin, but her usual confidence had been shaken, replaced by a quiet panic clawing at her chest. She had handled difficult passengers before, but this wasn't just any passenger. This was the daughter of the man who controlled the entire airline. As she entered the aisle, she could feel the weight of passengers' eyes on her. Did they know? Had word already spread? Her face burned at the thought. She quickly straightened her uniform, smoothing her hands over the fabric as she neared Lena's seat. Lena, however, hadn't moved. She sat comfortably, her expression unreadable, her fingers resting lightly on her phone. Unlike Miss Alden, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't unsettled. In fact, there was something calm, almost expectant, about the way she glanced up when Miss Alden finally stopped in front of her. A forced smile appeared on Miss Alden's lips. "Miss Calloway, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding earlier. I'd be happy to bring you any drink you'd like." The words were polite, but Lena could hear the tension beneath them, the stiffness in her voice, the hesitation in her posture. This wasn't genuine. This wasn't an apology. This wasn't a genuine apology. This was a flight attendant trying to clean up a mistake before it became something bigger. Lena tilted her head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Ms. Alden nodded quickly, her fingers tightening around the tray she held. "Yes, of course. I didn't mean to cause any inconvenience." Lena let the silence stretch just long enough for Miss Alden to shift uncomfortably. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't give anyone else water without asking. You didn't refuse anyone else juice. So what exactly was the misunderstanding?" The air between them grew heavy. A few passengers subtly turned their heads, pretending not to listen, but their curiosity was obvious. Miss Alden's throat felt dry. She stopped, struggling to find an excuse. Any excuse, but there wasn't one. Lena didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. She had already won. Still, she wasn't going to let Miss Alden slip away that easily. Folding her hands on her lap, Lena spoke again, her words quiet yet impossible to ignore. "If you're going to apologize, at least be honest about why you made that choice." Miss Alden's stomach twisted. For the first time, she felt small. The young girl in front of her had turned the power dynamic completely around. The same passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now watching intently, waiting to see what would happen next. A deep, unsettling realization sank into Miss Alden's chest. She had misjudged Lena, and now everyone could see it. She stood frozen for a moment, gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. The weight of Lena's words settled over her like a thick, inescapable fog. Passengers who had once pretended not to notice were now fully engaged. Their gazes flicked between the two. Some pretended to be absorbed in their books or screens, but their curiosity was unmistakable. Lena didn't break eye contact. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand anything. She simply waited. She wanted Miss Alden to acknowledge what had really happened, not just cover it up with empty words, not just try to fix the problem without addressing the real issue. Miss Alden inhaled sharply, trying to regain control of the moment. "I may have misjudged the situation," she said carefully, forcing a neutral tone. "I assure you, it wasn't intentional." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't it?" That single question made Miss Alden's stomach tighten. She glanced around, searching for an escape from the pressure mounting around her. But there was none. The cabin was silent. All eyes were on her. Near the galley, Celia stood with her arms folded, quietly observing. She had seen enough to know what was really happening. Miss Alden wasn't apologizing because she had suddenly realized her mistake. She was apologizing because she had been caught. For the first time, Miss Alden noticed the shift in the cabin. The control she once had was slipping. She had always been the authority figure in first class, the one who set the rules, the one who ensured everything ran smoothly. But now, the balance had changed. She wasn't in control anymore. Lena watched her, waiting for something real, something meaningful. But she already knew she wasn't going to get it. Miss Alden was too proud, too stuck in her ways, too unwilling to admit what she had really done. After a long pause, Lena exhaled and reached for her phone. She tapped out a quick message to her father. "She's apologizing, but she's not admitting what she did." Her response came almost instantly. "Understood." That was all he said. But it was enough. Lena set her phone back down and looked up at Miss Alden again, her expression unreadable. "Fine. I'll have the orange juice." Miss Alden nodded stiffly, eager to move past the moment. She turned quickly, heading toward the galley. Her legs felt strangely unsteady as she disappeared behind the curtain. Celia followed her. She had kept quiet long enough. "You should have just told her the truth." Miss Alden spun around, her voice sharp. "I don't need a lecture from you, Celia." Celia shook her head. "No. What you need is to realize that you didn't just misjudge her. You saw a young black girl in first class and assumed she didn't belong. You didn't check her ticket. You didn't ask questions. You just decided." Miss Alden's jaw clenched. "I said I." Celia scoffed. "No, you didn't. You just tried to make it go away." Miss Alden opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the intercom crackled to life. "Miss Alden, please report to the cockpit immediately." Celia's expression didn't change. "Looks like you're not done answering for this." Alden's stomach dropped. For the second time that day, she was being called to the cockpit. And this time, she knew it was worse. Her legs felt heavier with every step. Her breath was shallow. Her mind was racing, trying to anticipate what was waiting for her on the other side of that door. Passengers turned their heads slightly as she passed. Some pretended to be focused on their screens. Others barely hid their curiosity. Lena remained seated, calm as ever, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. She wasn't smiling, wasn't smirking, wasn't even looking at Miss Alden. That made it worse. If she had been gloating, Miss Alden could have convinced herself that this was just a spoiled child making trouble. But Lena wasn't reacting at all. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Miss Alden swallowed hard as she reached the cockpit door and knocked twice before stepping inside. Captain Elliot Grayson sat in his seat, his expression unreadable. The screen of the in-flight phone was still active, and Russell Kane, the airline senior operations manager, was on the line. But this time, there was someone else. A second figure appeared on the screen, and the air in the cockpit suddenly felt heavier. Emerson Calloway, the man who owned the airline, the man who controlled every flight, every employee, every decision made within the company, and, most importantly, the man who had just received a direct complaint about her. Miss Alden felt her mouth go dry. Emerson was calm as always. His presence alone carried weight, Not because he was loud, not because he was aggressive, but because he never needed to be. Even through a screen, his voice was controlled, steady, and cold. Miss Alden. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Do you understand why you're here? She clasped her hands together and forced herself to stay composed. Sir, I assure you, there was a misunderstanding. The passenger, my daughter, Emerson corrected. His voice was sharp as a blade. Miss Alden's heart skipped. Your daughter, she corrected quickly, was never intentionally denied service. There was a timing issue. I don't believe that. The way he said it left no room for argument. Russell's voice followed, just as unforgiving. We have received multiple accounts from both passengers and staff regarding your behavior. You were given an opportunity to correct your mistake, he continued. Instead, you offered a weak apology and refused to acknowledge the real issue. Miss Alden's fingers twitched. With all due respect, sir, I was simply following standard procedure. The situation has been resolved. Emerson tilted his head slightly, studying her. Tell me, Miss Alden, when you looked at Lena, what exactly did you see? Miss Alden hesitated. I don't understand the question. I think you do, Emerson said, because when you looked at her, you made a decision. His voice was calm, unwavering. You didn't question anyone else's seat. You didn't refuse service to anyone else. But when it came to my daughter, you assumed she didn't belong. The words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself. But Emerson wasn't shouting. He wasn't insulting her. He was simply stating a fact, and it was a fact she couldn't escape. The silence in the cockpit stretched. Finally, Russell spoke again. You will return to your position for the remainder of this flight. Upon landing, you are to report directly to airline headquarters for a formal review. Do you understand? Miss Alden nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. She turned toward the door, eager to leave. But then Emerson spoke again. His tone was even softer now, and that made it worse. Miss Alden, she stopped. I suggest you start thinking very carefully about how you're going to explain yourself. Because as of right now, your career is hanging by a thread. The screen went dark. The room was suddenly too quiet. Captain Grayson let out a slow breath, then turned to Miss Alden. You should get back to work. She nodded stiffly and turned to leave. But as she stepped out of the cockpit, she knew. This wasn't over. Miss Alden stepped out of the cockpit, but this time she didn't walk with the same authority she once had. Her posture was rigid, her face stiff, but inside, her mind was spiraling. A formal review. Direct orders from the airline's owner. Passengers watching her every move. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the beginning of something much worse. As she made her way back to the first-class cabin, the weight of the situation settled over her like a storm cloud. She had always taken pride in her ability to stay in control, to keep order in the cabin, to make decisions without question. But now, she wasn't the one enforcing the rules anymore. She was the one being watched. The whispers were already spreading, the glances were undeniable. People had seen what happened. They had seen her get called to the cockpit, had noticed her stiff posture, the way she had walked back without the same confidence she once carried. And then there was Lena Calloway. She was still in her seat, exactly where she had been before. Calm, poised, not gloating, not smug, but simply waiting. Miss Alden hesitated for a fraction of a second before crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. Her voice was neutral, steady, as if she were simply conducting business as usual. Miss Calloway, she said, carefully placing a glass of orange juice on the tray table in front of her. Here is your orange juice. Lena didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she looked at the glass for a moment, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet Miss Alden's. Her face didn't show much emotion. But the pause before she responded made Miss Alden's skin prickle with discomfort. Then, softly, Lena spoke. You seem nervous. Miss Alden's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. I just want to ensure you receive the service you are entitled to, she replied. Lena didn't take the glass immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. Why now? Miss Alden blinked. Excuse me? Lena's voice remained steady, even. You had juice before, she continued. Plenty of it. You poured it for everyone else. You skipped me on purpose, and when I asked, you lied. She let the words settle in the air before adding, and now, suddenly, you're bringing me what I asked for. Why? The question made Miss Alden's stomach twist. She had been hoping that simply delivering the drink would make the moment pass quickly, that Lena would take it and move on. But the girl wasn't letting her off that easy. Passengers around them were listening now. Eyes flickered toward their interaction. A businessman 2 seats away shifted slightly, stealing a glance from behind his laptop. Celia Reyes, who had been refilling drinks a few rows back, stopped what she was doing and turned slightly toward them, watching. Ms. Alden swallowed. "I told you it was a misunderstanding." Lena's expression remained unchanged. "No, it wasn't." The silence stretched between them. Lena finally reached for the glass, wrapping her fingers around it. But before she lifted it, she spoke one last time. "You made a choice." Ms. Alden felt her throat tighten. She had spent years enforcing policies, deciding who got what, who was worth extra effort and who wasn't. She had done it without thinking. But this time, she had been caught. And now, there was no escaping it. Lena took a slow sip of her juice, then placed the glass down with a quiet clink. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence was enough. Miss Alden stood up stiffly and turned away, making her way back to the galley. But as she walked, she felt something she had never felt before. She wasn't in charge anymore. And everyone knew it. Miss Alden's steps were quick and stiff as she walked back toward the galley, her hands clenched at her sides. The moment she passed through the curtain, she exhaled sharply, gripping the counter for support. The pressure in her chest felt suffocating. She had been humiliated. In front of the entire first-class cabin, by a teenager, across the galley, Celia was watching her carefully. She had seen Miss Alden handle plenty of difficult passengers before, but never like this, never with this kind of tension, this kind of weight pressing down on her. Celia's voice was unreadable. "Rough moment?" Miss Alden shot her a sharp look. "Not now, Celia." Celia shrugged, but didn't move. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You know," she said slowly. She didn't even have to raise her voice. Miss Alden let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't need a lecture from you." Celia didn't flinch. "No, I don't think you need a lecture." Her voice was calm, measured. "I think you need to realize that the way you've been treating people, it finally caught up with you." Miss Alden's jaw tightened. "I treated her the same way I would have treated anyone." Celia raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you only refuse service to her?" The words hit deeper than Miss Alden expected. For a moment she considered snapping back with a sharp response, something to shut Celia down. But nothing came, because deep down she knew Celia was right. She turned away, pretending to adjust a stack of cups, her mind racing. She needed to find a way to justify her actions, to convince herself that she hadn't done exactly what Celia was saying she had done. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't. Because Lena had been right too. Miss Alden had made a choice. And now, for the first time, she was facing the consequences. Miss Alden wanted to fire back, a sharp response, something to end the conversation, to shut Celia down. But nothing came. Because deep down, she knew Celia was right. She turned away, pretending to adjust a stack of cups, her mind desperately searching for something, anything that would make this feel less like her fault. But she couldn't find it. Her reflection in the metal panel of the galley cabinet stared back at her. And for the first time, she saw herself from the outside. A flight attendant who had spent years believing she was untouchable. A woman who had made assumptions about passengers without thinking twice. And now, she was the one under scrutiny. A chime from the in-flight phone made both women turn their heads. Miss Alden hesitated before reaching for it. She steadied herself, then picked up the receiver. "This is Miss Alden." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Miss Alden, this is Captain Grayson. Just letting you know we've received additional instructions from ground control regarding your status after landing." Miss Alden's stomach turned. "Regarding my status?" she repeated. "That's correct. You are to remain on board until further notice." The blood drained from her face. "Remain on board?" "Yes," the captain confirmed. "Security will be waiting at the gate. You'll be escorted for a formal meeting with airline management." The line clicked off. The silence in the galley was suffocating. Celia let out a slow breath. "Well," she muttered, "that's not good." Miss Alden's grip on the phone tightened, but she didn't say a word, because for the first time in her entire career, she wasn't sure if she'd still have a job by the time this flight landed. She placed the phone back on the hook. But her fingers trembled slightly as she let go. The air in the galley felt stifling, as if the walls were closing in on her. Security. Formal meeting. Ground control. The words echoed in her mind like a warning siren. She had spent years ensuring passengers followed the rules, making sure things were done her way. But now she was the one under orders. Now she was the one being watched, scrutinized, judged. And the worst part, she had no control over what happened next. Celia was still standing nearby, pretending to wipe down the counter. But it was clear she was waiting for a reaction. She wasn't gloating, but there was something knowing in her expression. Something that told Miss Alden she had seen this coming long before today. Miss Alden let out a slow, controlled breath and straightened her uniform. "I need to finish my shift," she muttered, mostly to herself. Celia scoffed. "You think handing out a few more drinks is going to change anything?" Miss Alden ignored her and stepped back into the first-class cabin. But this time, everything felt different. The moment she entered the aisle, she felt it. The shift. Passengers weren't just watching her, they were judging her. She could feel their eyes tracking her every move. Quiet whispers passed between them. She had never minded being the center of attention before. She had always been the one in charge, the one who set the tone of the cabin. But now, the power dynamic had flipped. For the first time, she was the outsider. She moved stiffly, forcing a polite smile as she adjusted a tray on a passenger's table. The man barely nodded at her, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, a woman in a gray blazer glanced at her, then looked away just as quickly. And then, there was Lena Calloway, still in her seat, still scrolling through her phone, her face calm. She hadn't said a word since their last exchange. But she didn't need to. She had already done enough. Ms. Alden took another step forward. And then, she heard it. A whisper, barely above the hum of the plane. "That's the one." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She didn't turn around. She didn't react. But she knew. People were talking. The story had already started spreading. Passengers had seen what happened. And now, they were sharing it. Quietly, subtly, but it was happening. And no matter how much she wanted to ignore it, she couldn't. Ms. Alden had always believed she was untouchable, that no matter what happened, the airline would back her, that she could make any decision she wanted, and no one would dare challenge her. But now, she wasn't so sure. She swallowed the knot in her throat and kept walking, pretending not to hear the whispers, pretending not to feel the stares burning into her back. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, one thought kept creeping back into her mind. This wasn't going away. And with every passing minute, it was only getting worse. Miss Alden moved robotically through the aisle, forcing herself to keep going, forcing herself to act normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Her hands weren't as steady, her voice wasn't as firm, and the forced politeness in her tone no longer carried the same weight, because the passengers could feel it too. The shift, the uncomfortable energy lingering in the air. She heard another whisper, another glance, another silent judgment. She wasn't the respected flight attendant anymore. She was the topic of conversation. And for the first time in her entire career, she wasn't sure how to handle it. Ms. Alden forced herself to continue the routine of service. She moved through the aisle, checking on passengers, offering drinks, doing everything she was supposed to do. But nothing felt right. Her hands weren't as steady. Her voice wasn't as firm. And the forced politeness in her tone no longer carried the same weight. The passengers could feel it too. The shift in power, the uncomfortable energy lingering in the air. A businessman in seat 2C cleared his throat as she passed. His eyes flicked toward Lena Calloway, then settled on Miss Alden. "Not your best moment, was it?" The words were spoken just low enough for her to hear. Miss Alden stiffened, her fingers tightening around the tray in her hands. She didn't respond. She couldn't. She quickly turned toward another passenger, an older woman in seat 4A, and forced a smile. "Can I offer you anything else, ma'am?" The woman barely looked up from her book. "Just water, please." Ms. Alden reached for a bottle, but as she placed it on the tray table, the woman spoke again. Her voice was soft, calm. "I saw what happened." The words sent a fresh wave of unease through Miss Alden's chest. She swallowed hard. "Excuse me?" she said, keeping her voice neutral. The woman finally met her gaze, her expression unreadable. I've been flying first class for years. I know how things work. I know who gets treated a certain way and who doesn't." She paused as if considering whether or not to say more. Then, in a tone that was neither cruel nor kind, she added, "You made a mistake today." Heat rose up Miss Alden's neck. The way the woman spoke, so calm, so matter-of-fact, so certain, made it worse. There was no accusation, no anger, just the undeniable truth. A mistake. The words lingered in Miss Alden's mind as she stepped away, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't used to feeling exposed like this. She was supposed to be the one who controlled the cabin, not the one who got whispered about. She turned toward the galley, needing a moment to breathe. But just as she did, her stomach dropped. Celia Reyes was standing near Lena's seat, and she was handing her a fresh glass of orange juice. Miss Alden froze. Lena accepted the drink with a small nod. Not looking surprised at all, Celia spoke softly, but from where Miss Alden stood, she couldn't make out the words. Then, before walking away, Celia did something unexpected. She placed a small pack of cookies on Lena's tray. A quiet, simple gesture. It shouldn't have meant anything. But it did, because it was more than just an act of kindness. It was a statement. Miss Alden's jaw clenched. Her heart pounded. Celia had just undermined her, not in an obvious confrontational way, but in a way that sent a clear message to everyone watching. Lena deserved better. Miss Alden turned sharply and stormed back toward the galley, her hands shaking with frustration. She slammed the tray down on the counter, gripping the edge so hard that her nails dug into the metal surface. A moment later, Celia followed her into the galley, her expression unreadable. Miss Alden turned on her, her voice low but furious. "What the hell was that?" Celia leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What was what?" Miss Alden's eyes burned with anger. "You went behind my back." Celia shrugged. "I did my job." Miss Alden's voice was sharper now. "No, you didn't. You deliberately corrected me in front of passengers." Celia didn't flinch. "Because you were wrong." The words landed like a slap. Miss Alden let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You have no idea what you've just done." Celia tilted her head slightly. "Oh, I think I do." Miss Alden narrowed her eyes. "You think this makes you a hero?" Celia sighed, her voice quieter now. "No." She met Miss Alden's gaze, steady and unshaken. "But I think for the first time, someone held you accountable. And you don't know how to handle it." Miss Alden stared at her, breathing heavily. She had spent years in control, years making decisions without question, years believing she would never have to answer for them. But now everything was slipping away. And Celia was right. She didn't know how to handle it. She didn't know what to do. For the first time in her career, she was powerless. Miss Alden stood frozen in the galley, her hands gripping the counter as Celia's words echoed in her mind. "For the first time, someone held you accountable. And you don't know how to handle it." It wasn't the words themselves that stung. It was the fact that they were true. Her entire career, she had been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules, the one who decided which passengers deserved courtesy and which ones didn't. She had built her authority on that belief, that she knew best. But now, for the first time, she was the one being questioned. She was the one being judged. She was the one being held accountable. And she had no idea what came next. Ms. Alden had always relied on her unshakable confidence, the belief that she knew best. But now, for the first time, she had been forced to answer for something she had done. And she hated it. Celia still stood across from her, watching carefully. There was no gloating in her expression, no satisfaction, just a quiet understanding, as if she had been waiting for this moment to happen for a long time. Ms. Alden inhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders. "You think I'm the villain here, don't you?" Celia didn't react right away. She seemed to consider the question before responding. "I think you made a decision without thinking about what it really meant." She paused, then added, "And now, you don't like that you're facing the consequences." Ms. Alden let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Consequences?" She shook her head. "Over a glass of juice?" Celia's eyes darkened slightly. "It was never about the juice. And you know it." Silence stretched between them. Ms. Alden wanted to argue, wanted to shift the blame, wanted to find any excuse that would make this not her fault. But she couldn't, because deep down she knew exactly what she had done. And now, everyone else did too. She turned away from Celia, needing a moment to compose herself. She reached for a fresh tray, desperate to distract herself with work. But then, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent and will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions." A slow, cold dread settled in Miss Alden's stomach. Landing. The flight would be over soon. And the moment the doors opened, she knew what would be waiting for her. Security. A formal meeting. A panel of executives who would be expecting an explanation. An explanation she didn't have. Her hands felt clammy as she reached for a water bottle, unscrewing the cap with slightly unsteady fingers. Celia watched her, then let out a quiet sigh. "You should start thinking about what you're going to say." Ms. Alden scoffed, though the sound was weaker than she intended. "And what would you suggest?" Celia shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe the truth." Miss Alden's jaw tightened. She took a long sip of water, avoiding Celia's gaze. The truth. Could she even say it out loud? That she had looked at Lena Calloway and made a judgment before the girl had even spoken? That she had assumed in an instant that the girl didn't belong in first class? That she had treated her differently? Not because of a mistake, but because of a choice? The thought made Miss Alden's chest tighten. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that. A ding from the overhead speakers signaled the final descent. Miss Alden inhaled sharply and turned to adjust the supplies one last time, as if carrying out her usual duties would somehow make this flight end differently. But no matter how much she tried to delay the inevitable, one thing was clear. She had run the cabin for years. But now, someone else was running her fate, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent. The engines hummed steadily as the runway came into view. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin as passengers adjusted their seatbelts, tucked away their belongings, and prepared for landing. To most, this was just another routine flight coming to an end. But for Miss Alden, this landing felt like a countdown to something she wasn't ready to face. She kept her movements controlled, her expression neutral. As she moved through the first-class cabin, checking passenger seatbelts and tray tables, it was an automatic task, one she had done hundreds of times before. But this time, every step felt heavier. Every glance from a passenger felt like a silent judgment. She stopped near Lena's row. The girl was calm. Her seatbelt was already fastened. Her phone rested in her hand as she absent-mindedly scrolled through messages. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Because, for the first time, Miss Alden was the one waiting to be acknowledged. The shift in power was suffocating. She cleared her throat, trying to make her voice sound as normal as possible. "Miss Calloway, are you comfortable for landing?" Lena finally looked up. There was no hostility in her gaze, no outward sign of anger, just a quiet certainty, a confidence that made Miss Alden feel small in a way she never had before. Lena looked up at Miss Alden, her expression calm and unreadable. "I'm fine," she said it simply, effortlessly. Then, after a pause, she added, "Are you?" The question made Miss Alden's breath catch for just a second. Was she? She forced a stiff nod. "Of course." Lena held her gaze for a moment longer before returning to her phone, dismissing her without another word. That dismissal cut deeper than an insult ever could. Miss Alden turned quickly and walked toward the front of the cabin, her heart pounding harder with every step. She wanted to get through landing, wanted to step off this plane and disappear before things got any worse. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option, because this wasn't just about Lena anymore. It was bigger than that. Passengers had witnessed everything. The whispers had already started. People had seen the way she treated Lena, the way she avoided responsibility, the way she had been forced into an apology she didn't want to give. And soon, word would spread beyond this cabin. She had spent her entire career making sure things ran smoothly, controlling how passengers saw her, ensuring she was always the one in charge. But now, for the first time, her reputation was no longer in her hands. A soft ding overhead signaled the final approach. The plane tilted slightly as it lined up with the runway. Ms. Alden reached for the intercom, her fingers trembling slightly as she made the final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate." Her voice was steady, but inside, She felt like she was unraveling. She placed the intercom back onto its holder and turned toward the galley, needing a moment to breathe. But before she could take a step, the in-flight phone buzzed again. She hesitated. She already knew who it was before she even picked up. Slowly, she reached for the receiver. "This is Ms. Alden." A pause. Then a deep, controlled voice came through the line. "This is Emerson Calloway." A sharp, ice-cold chill spread through her chest. She had spoken to executives before, handled complaints from high-status passengers, but never directly from the owner of the airline. Her throat went dry. "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then his voice came again. Calm, controlled, deadly in its precision. "You will remain on board after landing. My team will be waiting for you at the gate." Miss Alden felt her fingers tremble around the phone. "Sir, This is not up for discussion." Click. The line went dead. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just facing a passenger complaint. She was facing something much worse. The plane descended toward the runway. The airport lights came into view. Miss Alden stared blankly ahead, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear. She had spent years enforcing rules, deciding who deserved what, believing she would never have to answer for the way she treated people. But now, she was the one being called to answer. And there was no way out. The plane touched down with a soft but final thud. The tires screeched slightly against the runway. The familiar pull of gravity pushed everyone slightly forward in their seats as the aircraft slowed to a controlled taxi toward the gate. Normally, this was the part of the flight where relief set in, another journey completed. Another set of passengers delivered safely to their destination. But for Ms. Alden, this wasn't an ending. This was the beginning of something much worse. She stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the counter to steady herself as the plane taxied toward the terminal. The seconds stretched unbearably, each moment bringing her closer to whatever was waiting for her on the other side of the cabin doors. She had heard stories before. Flight attendants who had been disciplined, those who had been let go quietly after a serious passenger complaint. But those cases had involved regular customers. This was different. This was Emerson Calloway, the owner of the entire airline. And Lena, she wasn't just another passenger, she was his daughter. Miss Alden swallowed hard, her pulse loud in her ears. The overhead ding signaled the seatbelt sign turning off, and like clockwork, passengers began unbuckling and stretching. Some reached for their bags in the overhead compartments. The usual soft murmur of conversation filled the cabin. But this time, there was something different in the air. People weren't just talking about their layovers, their connections, or their final destinations. They were talking about her. They had seen everything. And now, she had to face whatever was waiting for her outside that door. They weren't talking about their layovers. They weren't talking about their next destinations. They were talking about her. And she could feel it. Ms. Alden caught snippets of hushed voices as she walked toward the front of the cabin. "She's in trouble for sure. Did you see how she handled that girl? Unbelievable. I knew something was up the moment she got called to the cockpit." She forced her expression to remain neutral, her hands locked tightly in front of her. She wouldn't let them see her panic. But it wasn't just the whispers. The looks were worse. Passengers stole glances at her, some brief, some lingering. But all of them carried the same unspoken message. They knew. She turned slightly, her gaze landing on Lena Calloway. The girl was still seated, calm and composed, completely unbothered by the chaos around her. She had made no effort to rush off the plane, no attempt to blend into the crowd. She was waiting. For exactly what? Ms. Alden didn't know. And that terrified her. A loud knock from outside the aircraft made her jump slightly. She turned her head, just in time to see the jet bridge connecting to the cabin door. The sound of the latch unlocking sent another wave of unease crawling up her spine. The doors opened. The usual first-class passengers were expected to disembark first. Some moved quickly, eager to get on with their travels, while others lingered just a little longer than necessary, just long enough to steal a final look at her before stepping off the plane. Miss Alden turned away, feeling a prickle of heat on her neck. Then, just as she was about to move toward the front, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. A hush settled over the remaining passengers. The officer, a tall man with a broad frame, scanned the area before his gaze settled on her. Miss Alden. Her entire body stiffened. The moment she had been dreading was here. She nodded quickly, struggling to keep her voice steady. Yes. The officer's tone remained professional but firm. I'm going to need you to come with me. Passengers froze. Some were still seated in first class. Conversations went silent. Even the air inside the cabin felt thicker. For years, Miss Alden had been the one with authority. She had been the one calling the shots, deciding how passengers were treated, making the rules as she saw fit. But now she was the one being escorted off the plane. She tried to keep her steps measured, her back straight, her expression unreadable as she walked toward the exit. But she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. As she passed Lena's row, she didn't look at her, but she knew. The girl was watching. She could feel it. For the first time in her career, Miss Alden wasn't just stepping off a plane. She was walking straight into the consequences of her own actions. The cool air of the jet bridge hit her skin as she followed the security officer, her movements stiff and controlled. The familiar hum of the airport surrounded her. The distant chatter of passengers, the occasional announcement over the intercom. But everything felt muted, distant. Her mind raced as she tried to prepare herself for what was coming. A formal meeting. A panel of executives. Emerson Callaway. She had never met him in person. Only seen his name in company-wide emails. Heard about him in conversations among senior staff. He was known for running his airline with precision, for making sure every detail, every employee, every rule was followed to perfection, and she had just mistreated his daughter. Ms. Alden clenched her jaw, trying to keep her panic from surfacing. There had to be a way to fix this. Maybe she could argue that Lena had exaggerated, that the passengers had misunderstood. Maybe she could frame it as a simple service mistake, rather than intentional discrimination. But deep down, she knew none of that would work, because this wasn't just about Lena anymore. This was about everyone who had watched it happen. Passengers had seen it, Celia had seen it. The whispers had already started, and once a reputation like this started spreading, it never stopped. The security officer led her through a private corridor, away from the usual passenger exits. The hallway was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly as they walked. The further they went, the heavier Miss Alden's footsteps felt. Finally, they reached a large conference room, and she knew there was no turning back now. The conference room had glass walls, but it still felt suffocating. Inside, 4 executives were seated at a long table. One of them was Damon Whitaker, the senior operations manager. She had spoken to him earlier, and now his expression was unreadable. But the way his fingers tapped against the table suggested impatience. And at the head of the table, seated with his hands folded neatly in front of him, was Emerson Callaway. Miss Alden's stomach tightened. The security officer gestured toward the door. "You can go in now." Her mouth was dry as she stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a soft but final click. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating. Then, Emerson Callaway lifted his gaze to meet hers. His expression was unreadable, calm, controlled, but dangerous in its stillness. Finally, he spoke. "Sit." The single word felt heavier than an entire speech. Ms. Alden swallowed hard and obeyed, lowering herself into the chair directly across from him. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her uniform. Mr. Callaway studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you understand why you're here, Miss Alden?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I do." His voice remained calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "Then tell me." A lump formed in Miss Alden's throat. "Choose your words carefully," she told herself. "There was a misunderstanding during the flight, sir." No, the interruption was sharp, immediate. Her pulse quickened. Mr. Callaway leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "You are not here because of a misunderstanding, Miss Alden. You are here because of a choice you made." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, because he was right. He let the silence stretch, giving her a moment to absorb the weight of what he had just said. Then he continued. "You looked at my daughter. You saw her sitting in first class, and you made an assumption." His tone didn't rise, didn't waver. "You decided, without checking her ticket, without speaking to her, that she didn't belong, and because of that decision, you treated her differently than every other passenger in that cabin." The room felt unbearably small. Damon Whitaker shifted slightly in his seat, flipping through a stack of papers. "We have statements from multiple passengers," he said, "including staff." His eyes flicked up. "Your colleague, Celia Reyes, reported that you made no effort to correct your actions, even after the situation was brought to your attention." Ms. Alden's nails dug into her palms. Mr. Calloway tilted his head slightly. "Do you deny any of this?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, wanted to say that it wasn't that simple, that she hadn't meant anything by it, that it was a mistake blown out of proportion. But could she? Would that even help her now? Her mind spun, grasping at any possible defense. But there wasn't one. And for the first time since the moment she had refused Lena that drink, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. Mr. Calloway exhaled softly, leaning back in his chair. "You have worked for this airline for years, Miss Alden. I assume you know our policies well?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, of course." He held her gaze. "Then you know that discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious, is not tolerated here. Ever." A sharp pressure built in her chest. Damon Whitaker slid a document across the table. "We are conducting an internal review of your actions. Effective immediately, you are suspended until further notice, pending the results of this investigation." Miss Alden's breath hitched. Suspended. Suspended. The word echoed in her mind. "Did you think you'd walk away from this with nothing?" Damon's voice was cool even. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself. But the reality of the situation had already crashed over her like a wave. She had lost control. Mr. Calloway stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket as he did. "You should take this time to think very carefully about what you've done, Miss Alden." She stayed silent, her head lowered slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The meeting was over. But for Miss Alden, this was just the beginning of the fallout. She sat motionless, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, suspended until further notice. The words looped endlessly in her mind. Refusing to settle, she had spent years climbing the ranks, perfecting her authority in first class, ensuring that passengers followed the standards she set. She had controlled every flight, every interaction, every outcome. But now, she controlled nothing. For years, Miss Alden had controlled every interaction, every outcome. And now, she was nothing more than an employee awaiting judgment. The executives had already begun gathering their documents. Their decision had been made. Damon Whitaker was flipping through a set of files, making quiet notes with a pen. The other two executives murmured softly to each other, their discussion no longer about her. She was no longer important. She had been dismissed. Ms. Alden swallowed hard, forcing herself to straighten her shoulders. "Sir," she said, her voice tight. Damon raised an eyebrow but didn't stop writing. At the door, Mr. Calloway, who had just reached for the handle, paused slightly and turned back to look at her. His expression remained unreadable. Ms. Alden inhaled, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. "I understand that my actions today were seen as unacceptable," she began carefully. "But I have been a loyal employee of this airline for years. I've upheld every protocol, every standard. I've given everything to this company." She hesitated, her throat tightened. "Surely that counts for something?" Mr. Calloway studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you believe your years of service justify what you did today?" Ms. Alden's stomach twisted. "No, sir, I just—" "Then why bring it up?" His voice wasn't loud. He hadn't even raised it, but somehow it crushed her more than if he had shouted. Her nails dug into her palms. "I made a mistake," she admitted, struggling to keep her voice even. "No." Mr. Calloway corrected her smoothly, stepping forward. "A mistake is when you spill coffee on a passenger. A mistake is when you misplace a meal order. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice." Her breath hitched slightly. "You saw my daughter sitting in first class and decided she wasn't supposed to be there." His eyes locked onto hers. "You didn't check her ticket. You didn't ask a question. You made an assumption. And then, even when you had the chance to correct it, you didn't. You doubled down. You dismissed her. You treated her as if she was invisible." Miss Alden clenched her jaw. Mr. Calloway tilted his head slightly. "And do you know what the worst part is?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. "This is probably not the first time you've done it," he said quietly. "It's just the first time you got caught." The words hit harder than anything else he had said before. A sharp, suffocating silence filled the room. She wanted to protest, to insist that he was wrong, that she had never done this before. But had she? Had she ignored other passengers in the past because she assumed they didn't belong? Had she overlooked certain requests because deep down she didn't think those passengers deserved the same level of service? Had she done this without realizing it, or worse? Had she known all along? Her pulse pounded in her ears. Damon Whitaker slid another document toward her. You will be contacted with further instructions about your review process. Until then, you are not to report for duty. Miss Alden barely heard him. Her mind was stuck, repeating Mr. Calloway's words over and over again. This is not the first time you've done it. It's just the first time you got caught. She had always seen herself as an authority figure, someone who kept the order, who set the tone of the cabin. She had never questioned how she set that tone. Never thought twice about the subtle ways she controlled who was treated with respect and who wasn't. She had believed she was untouchable. But now she was being forced to face the truth of who she really was. The meeting was over. The executives stood, gathering their things. Mr. Calloway gave her one last glance. Then, he walked out of the room without another word. Miss Alden sat frozen in her chair, her hands still curled into fists. For years, she had dictated the rules of first class. Now, for the first time, she was being judged by them. And this time, she wouldn't be the one deciding her own fate.